started as a presentation a long time ago, and it was strictly about the nurses in the First World War. But as with all these things, it's grown quite a lot, and it now encompasses all the medical services for the soldiers in the First World War, on the Western Front really, and it's really about the chain of evacuation from the trench to the convalescent home back here, and it does involve the nurses. So my interest in this, as a couple of you here know, is that I was a nurse, and in fact I retired 6 years ago today, and it was 50 years to the day since I started nursing, so today's a bit of a celebration. My other reason for being interested in this is that I have been out to the battlefields to see the grave of my great-uncle, who died from a gunshot wound in Belgium. And while I was there, people gave me information about following the route that he would have taken to the hospital where he died. And that's really how I became interested in all of that. So, we're going to start with the history of nursing, and a little bit of basic stuff to begin with, if I can get it to move on. So in the Middle Ages, the sick were cared for by the monasteries. It was a monastic thing, or people, benefactors would pay for someone to look after you. But it was a general just care of the sick. There were no nurses as such then. After the Reformation, well, at the Reformation, Henry VIII destroyed all that. He destroyed the monasteries, and then we had a situation where the sick had no one to care for them, and the sick couldn't work, and so you were very poor, and you went into the workhouse. And gradually, over the years, the workhouses developed their own infirmaries, and I think gradually the government realised that these people were not working because they were sick, they needed looking after. And they keep going that way. This is an early picture of a workhouse infirmary. Clearly those ladies are there because they're very elderly and they just need someone to look after them. The nurse in the uniform may or may not have been a nurse. She probably was not trained. I don't know the date of it, so I can't be sure. A lot of the nursing in workhouses was done by other inmates, the paupers, who were fairly fit, looked after those who were not fit, and of course you can imagine the care wasn't very good. This is a picture of an infirmary ward. It's actually Crumpsall Infirmary in 1897, and I know that for a fact because that's where one of my great-grandfathers died, on that ward in 1897. Unfortunately, I don't know which one he is. He may well be one of those. And you notice they're all sitting by the beds, except one man. So things had changed by then. So what had changed? Well, what had happened was nurse training came in, and it's all to do with this lady, of course, Florence Nightingale, and she came from a fairly well-to-do family, and the family were not keen on her nursing, but she wanted to go and do it. And she looked at the state of nursing in this country and really was not happy with it. She went off to Germany, where she trained as a nurse in Kaiserwerth, and when she came back to this country, she eventually set up her own nurse training school in St Thomas's Hospital on the banks of the River Thames. And if you know London and the River Thames, that's how it used to look. St Thomas's doesn't look like that anymore. But St Thomas's was such a good training school that other hospitals all around the country picked up on the idea, and they followed suit and they did it. But it wasn't mandatory. The training was just good, but that's about all it was. At that point, in the late 1800s, the only nurses that were allowed to nurse in the army were the Army Nursing Service. So they were a specialist group of people. There weren't many of them. They were allowed to go with the army and look after them. And they served in all sorts of places. The Zulu War, the son of the man who died in Crumpsall, he was in the Zulu War, ancestor of mine, the Egyptian campaign, the Sudan War, and the Boer War. And when they were following the soldiers, they lived in these tented residences. and that's actually the nurses at Mafeking. So they were a tough lot. They weren't nurses like we might think of them. Right, so when we get to the First World War, things were beginning to change, but one of the problems was that nursing wasn't regulated. Nowadays, you can't say you're a nurse unless you are a nurse. A few of us here say we are ex-nurses, don't we? We're no longer nurses. It was some time before regulation came in, and that meant all sorts of people came along and wanted to help. They wanted to do some care of the wounded, because they could see that this war was pretty awful and it was dragging on. So to begin with, we had some military nurses that were set up early in the century, and they were the Queen Alexandra nurses. And then we had a load of ladies who had lots of money and nothing to do, and decided they would go and help. And that was, I think they were doing it for their own glory, quite honestly. I'll tell you about them in a minute. Then there was the voluntary aid detachment, which was a unit. It wasn't a nurse, it was a unit. And the girls who worked for it became known as VADs. And that was set up by the British Red Cross and St John together for the War Office. And that was before the war. There was a group of nurses called the First Aid Nursing Yeomanry who go by the horrible acronym of FANY. There were the Royal Army Medical Corps were soldiers. They were generally soldiers who didn't want to fight, and they formed as stretcher bearers during the war. And we also had Army medics. The Army medics were all officer status, and they were in the Royal Army Medical Corps. So all those people together did care for the wounded during the war. So where did all these nurses work? Well, initially they were working just in this country, but eventually they did go out to the Western Front. But to begin with, nurses were not allowed into France and Belgium, and so the volunteers went there. And eventually the army woke up to the fact that actually nurses were very useful, and we do need some, and we will allow it to happen. So nurses did work everywhere, all across the Western Front, the Eastern Front with Russia, it was very cold, and the Western Mediterranean. There were a lot of nurses in Malta during the First World War. And also they worked not just in the places you would expect them to work, but they also worked in big casualty clearing stations out close to the front, on hospital trains. Some nurses worked on barges for people who needed to be transported smoothly without a bumpy ride, and a lot of them were in base hospitals on the northern French coast, on the hospital ships across the Channel, and in the military hospitals here in the UK. So they were everywhere. So these aristocratic ladies, well, they decided that they would just go off to the continent, and they would set up their own hospitals. And they took their own staff, their maids and their porters and their workmen, gardeners and everything, took them all with them, and got their own transport, their own ambulances, and off they went, and they set up hospitals. And mostly that was in France and Belgium, and that went on for quite some time. One particular lady was known as Medicine Millie. She was quite famous. Very, very attractive woman when she wasn't doing this in France. Very attractive, aristocratic lady. She had time and money to go out to France, and she organised her own ambulance unit. And in the First World War, an ambulance was not a thing on wheels. It was a group of facilities that all moved together to look after the sick. And so she took the unit with her doctors, and they went off to the siege of Namur in Belgium, and she was there some considerable time. And as a result of that, she was decorated the French Croix de Guerre and the Belgian Royal Red Cross and the British Red Cross. So she was respected for what she did. Now, I've already said to you that she is a very attractive lady, very glamorous. This is what she looked like during the war. Can you see the screen? That's her sitting with some soldiers with a very drab uniform on, and she really did dive in and do lots of work. So this is a nurse from the Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service. It's an organisation that's lasted down the years, and I've shown you this really just to show you what the uniform looked like. And the cape, which was characteristic of these nurses, was grey with a scarlet edge. And this is Sister Agnes Mitchell-Boyd. I'm not sure what she was famous for though. Now this service was created in 1902 because during the Boer War the government realised that the care of the wounded was crucial to success. In the past, battlefield tactics where you charge at each other and kill each other, but it was changing with the Boer War, and they realised that they needed somebody to care for the sick, and they wanted to have a group of trained nurses, but they also wanted a group of volunteer nurses who could fill the space that was left by the trained nurses going away. So to be a Queen Alexandra nurse, you had to be single, you couldn't come with a husband and kids, and you had to be over 25, and you have to be of a certain status. You have to be middle class, you have to be a lady. But by 1914 there weren't many of them, just under 300, but by Christmas of 1914 we got well over 2,000 of them, and by 1918 10,000 trained nurses in Queen Alexandra service. So they really were the sisters that were doing the nursing out at the front. The VADs, as I said, a VAD is a voluntary aid detachment, not the person. So that was formed a bit later in 1909 because the government again realised that they needed to have a number of trained individuals or semi-trained individuals to fill any gaps that were created by the nurses going off to the war. And there were 2,500 units when the war broke out, and by Christmas time, or by the end of the war, there were 90,000 units. Believe it or not, there were some male VADs. They had a slightly different function to the females, but there were a good 500 of them. This picture demonstrates what we think of a VAD as a girl in uniform. This is what they look like. And so the one on the left is a Red Cross nurse, because you've got the Red Cross on her chest, and the one on the right is a St John nurse, and the one in the middle, just a War Office nurse. So they were identifiable by which organisation they were sponsored by. Before the war, these voluntary aid detachments consisted of a commandant, a quartermaster, and a lady superintendent. And there were 20 women in this unit, and some of them had to be qualified cooks. What did they get up to? Well, I think it all sounds very much like St John Ambulance Brigade meetings from years ago. Did anybody belong to St John Ambulance? Yeah. Or Red Cross? You used to go along to meetings, and what did you do? Well, they met at least monthly, sometimes every week, and they had to work towards getting a home nursing certificate and a first aid certificate within the year. So they had to have had certifiable training. And they were sent off to work in the local hospitals each week, just to get some experience of ward work in case they ever find themselves working in the hospital properly. And sometimes they would do outdoor training, particularly when the men weren't around. So they did some stretcher duties, and they learned how to transport sick and injured people, and they learned to sort of fend for themselves outdoors, a bit like Boy Scouts really. Because it was known that if they did go out to war, it would be a pretty rough existence. So by 1915, the government decided that we need some of these VAD nurses who at that point were just working in the UK. We wanted them out in the military hospitals to help out. And so by then, you had to be 21 to 46. So that's the lady who showed me the picture. Yeah. I said 20, didn't I? I think it was 21 you have to be, yes. But the lady in your picture said she was 17?
Well, that's right, I don't know for sure. That's what she said, yeah.
Bit like the boy soldiers who lied about their age, I think, yeah. And I'm sure a lot of that went on. And you had to be vaccinated, not against tetanus, but against enteric fever. So the soldiers were vaccinated against tetanus. Initially they had 1 month probation, and then if they were good enough, they were given a 6-month contract. And they were employed directly by the War Office, and they were paid the grand sum of £20 a year. That doesn't sound much, but I don't think I was paid much more than that when I started nursing. Can you remember, Maggie? It wasn't very much, was it? No. And they were required to live in, a bit like we were, and they were under the control of the matron who dominated everything they did. And they were allowed some money every year for bits and pieces. And they were allowed 7 days leave in the first 6 months, which I think is quite good, and 14 days in the second. What did they do? Well, as we said, they were poorly paid, and they weren't very welcome. The trained nurses resented them, and the VADs didn't particularly like the trained nurses either. And it took a long time before they really came to value each other. So they could be thrown out pretty quickly if they didn't toe the line. And so the duties really were largely domestic. So they did all the hard work, cleaning floors, emptying bedpans, changing the bed linen. I think they also did laundry as well. And only late in the war were they allowed to do things like change dressings, even though they had some basic training for it. And the reason they were allowed to do it then was because the trained nurses were just so pushed with everything they were doing, they would delegate that to the nurses to do basic dressings. And so some of them were men, but what the men did was largely transporting wounded soldiers to and from Britain on and off trains and things like that. The VADs also manned something called rest stations, and this was where usually soldiers coming home from the front, when they arrived, they would be served tea and coffee and sandwiches and made a fuss of. And there's another picture of them doing it, waiting for soldiers to come off the train in London, I think that is. So there are a couple of famous VADs, well, a lot of famous ones, but two that I would like you to know about. The first one is Vera Brittain. Has anyone read Vera Brittain's book? Yeah. Fantastic book. Testament of Youth, in which she talks about being a VAD and losing the love of her life and a brother and a friend. And ultimately, later in life, she became a pacifist. But she came from a good family and she was a VAD. The other lady is rather shocking, because you wouldn't expect to see this one. Princess Sophia Duleep Singh was the daughter of a Maharaja who kind of lost his position back in India, and they found themselves in this country. And she was the goddaughter of Queen Victoria, and she was really thought of highly, and she became quite a famous suffragette, and she worked as a VAD nurse. But you hadn't heard of that one before. So this other book, The First Aid Nursing Yeomanry, the Fannies, well, this was formed before the war as well, and these were really a female version of the Home Guard. Last week, my group went on a visit to the Home Guard at Hooton, and I don't know if any of you have ever been there, but it is really worth going to. It's the old RAF station, and people are there, people who like to dress up and reenact the Second World War. So there were all sorts of people in khaki and with old motorbikes and old cars and all sorts of things, and we had a lovely time wandering around there. So I recommend that. Last Sunday of every month they're open. So these girls were female home guards, really, and this was the sort of thing they would get up to. They could do anything. They weren't essentially nurses, but they could do nursing, apart from everything else. And This was the particulars, this was the requirements, and obviously you can't read it, but what it does say that these girls needed to be, they needed to have a first aid qualification, home nursing, they needed to be able to ride and look after a horse, and I think for some of them they had to have their own horse with them. They had to be able to do veterinary work, camp cooking and signalling, so all-round talent really, and they were tough girls. And they could mend their own cars as well. So they did a variety of jobs. So one of the problems we have is that a lot of these ladies thought that it was patriotic to go and do their duty, and it would be very exciting and thrilling, and I'll get away from mother, and I won't have to sit in the drawing room listening to the vicar, and I can get out and have a bit of excitement. But they didn't realise what they were letting themselves in for. And this picture shows some very genteel ladies waiting to get on the train, and they were thrown into military hospitals where horrors awaited them. And part of the problem was that these girls had never done domestic work, couldn't do the washing up. They had not the right type of education. They could probably sing and play the piano. Some of them fainted when they saw the wounds, which were pretty ghastly wounds. And more to the point, some of them had never seen a naked male body before. It came as a bit of a shock. So it was a baptism of fire for some of these girls. So the morbidity is disease as opposed to mortality, which is death. So what were the illnesses that we were experiencing on the front? Well, first of all, there was trench foot, which was could go on to be gangrene, and it killed a large number of British soldiers in World War I. Now, I didn't bring a picture of trench foot because I thought you might have just had your tea. Not very nice. I've got a picture somewhere of soldiers sitting on the step or on the trench, and they've got their boots off and they're having their feet inspected to make sure that they're all okay. And they were advised to put oil on their feet. In cold weather, the oil didn't freeze, so their feet wouldn't get quite so cold. So this is a picture of soldiers who have got trench foot. They're being carried back away from the trench by able-bodied soldiers. The trench fever that was quite common was a flu-like condition, really, headaches and aching muscles and things like that, and it was caused by these horrible little creepy crawlies, these ticks, body lice. There's a picture of them somewhere. So this is typhus, which was caused by fleas and lice, and most of the soldiers' uniform was riddled with these things. In their spare time, they like to sit and pick them out of the seams and crunch them and kill them. How many can we get rid of? But it's like other forms of vermin. They come back faster than you get rid of them. Obviously, there was a lot of influenza, a lot of TB. Some men probably went into the army suffering from TB and it spread. A lot of pleurisy and pneumonia. And quite a few soldiers died from pneumonia. Sexually transmitted diseases were rife, probably one of the biggest conditions that the soldiers suffered from. It affected 1 soldier in 9 during the war. For every 9 soldiers, 1 had a sexually transmitted disease. But if you were Canadian, it was 1 in 5. They were better paid. And tetanus, of course, even though they were vaccinated, it did still kill many people from dirty wounds. The gas gangrene is a type of wet gangrene, and it's caused by a bacteria that likes to live where there is no oxygen, and it's a particularly foul-smelling condition. So, did I miss one there? Did I? Gas inhalation, yes. That came sort of a little way into the war. It happened in the Second Battle of Ypres. That's where we first came across it. The Germans sent the gas over. The British were absolutely horrified at the things the Germans could do. And then the British did it as well. So there was gas everywhere. So nurses' clinical practice. So we started off with girls who were capable of making beds and putting bandage on and things like that, and they learned very quickly how to do much more experienced things. And so the wounds were very, very complex. Looking after those was an issue. When the men came in from the trenches, they not only had horrific wounds, but there was mud in the wounds, and there was bits of clothing and probably bits of missiles in there as well. So they would have to very, very quickly get the uniform on and wash the patient, rehydrate them because they might have been lying out in the field for days, in a matter of minutes because the doctor was waiting to see the next patient. They had to be ready for that. And the nurses had to quite often pick shrapnel from the wounds. I've got a piece of shrapnel at home that I didn't think to bring, that we picked up at Delville Wood on the front. So if you go to battlefields now, you can very, very quickly see bits of metal in the ground. They're everywhere. But what they were experiencing in these wounds, this is a picture of some Russian shrapnel. The writing is Russian. And those little bits of metal would get into all the wounds, and trying to get them out was a nightmare. And you will have heard, I'm sure, of people, elderly people who've said, I've got a bit of shrapnel in my neck still, because sometimes it couldn't be removed. So later in the war, they did learn to be able to transfuse blood. Somebody had already come up with the concept of transfusing blood, but it was very, very difficult in the war. What they had to do, it had to be person to person. So you sit down there, I sit next to you, we take blood out of you by a tube straight into me. And of course, I don't think they were that aware of blood groups and things like that. But during the war, somebody invented refrigeration, a portable refrigerator for the blood, and they learned to put sodium citrate in the blood to stop it clotting. So that was an innovation of the war. And so these nurses would have to have specialist dressings that they might not have come across before. And this one in particular, I don't know if this was used in the UK, this is sphagnum moss. This moss is quite a prolific grower, and when applied to wounds, it does help them to heal. So we don't use it anymore, although I know we've started to use honey on wounds nowadays, so we're going back to these old days. But that was a very good way of treating the wounds, and they had to know about all the different antiseptics they could use. Now this nurse here, who's got a bottle on the pole with some tubing. The tubing goes into the patient's leg dressing, and what she's doing there is infusing a particular solution that is to treat the bacteria for gas gangrene. And she had to know how to do that. It's quite a specialist thing if you've not done it before. So the skill mix rapidly developed because they were working as teams. And here we have the doctor doing his round. I believe the doctor's the guy in the black suit. Nowadays doctors don't come around in their ordinary clothes. And what we have there are a couple of nurses, and towards the back we've got a Red Cross nurse, a Red Cross VAD. And they're looking at the patient's leg, I think the patient's foot. This picture on the left I think is Australian, and this is an operating theatre. And what we have there are nurses who now are helping the surgeon to do his work, and gradually they were trained to give anaesthetics as well. So nursing skills were improving all the time. This is the evacuation from the trench to the hospital. So what we have, first of all, we have the stretcher bearers bringing the patient out of the mud. And they go to the regimental aid post, which was just first aid. It was probably in the trench. And from there they were taken by a motor ambulance or maybe a horse ambulance round to the may well be another first aid post, and then on to a casualty clearing station. And if they were deemed fit for travel, unfit for service but fit enough to travel for further treatment, they would go into a hospital train to go up the coast to northern France to the base hospitals, and if they were thought to be sufficiently fit to travel further, they would then be taken over the channel in a ship to Britain. So that is the evacuation train. The stretcher bearers, a crucial part of all of this, the regimental stretcher bearers were men who were working within the regiment. They were men who carried weapons, they were in the trenches, and they were sent out with a stretcher to get the man back off the field from no man's land. And sometimes they were killed in the process. They had a very difficult job getting men back from the mud. Sometimes they would just bring back the bodies. But the Royal Army Medical Corps, well, these gentlemen sitting there, these were non-combatants. Generally speaking, they were men who were conscientious objectors, and although they were happy to, they refused to carry weapons. So they worked in the medical service, and they take the wounded up to the advanced age post where they could be treated by the doctors and nurses. And I've seen a memorial to these men, and so 743 officers were killed. They were the doctors, and 6,130 other ranks. And if you were going to get a VC, if you were in the RAMC and going to get a VC, you would only get it if you were an officer. Other ranks didn't get a VC in this service. So, getting these injured out of the field, well, there we have a shell hole full of water and mud, and these 4 stretcher bearers are negotiating that mud to get them back to the trench, to the first aid post. Sometimes they carried men, if the road was fairly good, on one of these contraptions, which is a stretcher with enormous wheels on, like penny farthings without a small wheel. I don't think that was used very often. Sometimes also the injured were put on these small trucks and taken along the tramway by horse. And these were really used for transporting weapons and materials, but if it was available, they could carry an injured man back to the post. So the regimental aid post, which was the front line dressing station, that's where the stretcher bearers first took their man. It could be something as simple as that, or a dugout. It was very crude, it was in or very, very close to the trenches. It was very rudimentary. They were taken there for very basic first aid. Slight wounds were treated, the man might be sent back to duty, or he might be taken on further. Now, this is where triage was used. It was not where it was first used. It had been discovered, I think, in the Crimea. But I'm sure many of you have been to hospital and you've been triaged, haven't you? Yeah, that's the reaction I was expecting. Yeah, we don't like it, do we? Triage now is not quite the same as it was then. Then, I mean, triage means to divide people into 3 different groups. And so when there was a walking wounded, they could just go back to the front line, carry on fighting. Those who needed surgery or further treatment, they needed to go on to specialist care and maybe to a base hospital on the coast. And there were those people for whom there was no chance of recovery, and you made them as comfortable as possible and left them to die. Thankfully, the triage nurse in A&E doesn't do that, doesn't park you in the corner now and leave you to die. That's the idea. Who doesn't need much care? Who does need the care? We need to get them in and deal with them. That's what it's all about. So, the advanced dressing stations, the casualty will be taken by a horse-drawn ambulance. It's all long order. So, when they arrive, they could be patched up and sent back to the trench, or they could go on to the clearing station. And this is the clearing station on Hill 60 in Ypres. This was where my great-uncle was shot in the thigh, at Hill 60, and he would quite likely have been in that clearing station. It isn't very clear. What you can't see there is that the man right in the middle with the arm in a sling is staring blankly at the camera. What's called the 1,000-yard stare, which was characteristic of post-traumatic stress. Wasn't recognised in those days, but when we look at the pictures now, we can see that he's completely numb. So there's a horse ambulance, which could negotiate muddy ground fairly well, and this was a motor ambulance, and this is actually driven by 2 nurses. Don't quite know how they got to be ambulance drivers then. All those who were treated and sent on to further treatment were given a medical card, and on there is their name and their rank and their number and what the wound was, and this says bullet wound in the thigh. And he carried that with him. He had it pinned to his front, so when he went on to the next facility they would know what the problem was. And these men are sitting waiting with their cards attached to them. They're waiting for further treatment, and they're all grinning from ear to ear because they probably think they're out of the action for a while. This is a casualty clearing station. It was much further back from the line than the others. It was also mobile. If the trenches, the line, ever moved, which it didn't very often, if it did move, the casualty clearing station would move with it, so it was always some way behind the fighting. And it usually consisted of 3 tents. There were 2 or 3 tents, and the thinking behind that was the first tent took the incoming wounded, and they tended to all come in a mass. The nurses would be told, we've got 50 men coming in tonight, and they would all come together and then put them on the tent, and they'd deal with them all. And then the next group that came in would go in the second tent and then the third tent. So there was always rotation of the first lot that came in, hopefully the first lot to go out again. And it had at least 50 beds and 150 stretchers in that casualty clearing station. It was very busy, so doctors and nurses working there. This is a casualty clearing station in a very large hospital. This is Bailleul. When I went to the Western Front, I was directed to this hospital. This is where my great-uncle went with his wound. It's an enormous mental hospital which had been cleared, a bit like Denby, one of those big old hospitals, and it was full of wounded soldiers. These soldiers lying on the ground, it's thought to have been gassed. Reports at the time from some of these clearing stations said that the building was full, the gardens were full of men on stretchers, the fields around it were full of men on stretchers. They just had nowhere to put them. And my great-uncle died there. So the gas masks, well, I'm sure you've probably heard that when they first heard about gas, they didn't quite know what to do about it. So they gave them all cotton wool pads, put on their face. Do you know what they did next? No? They had to soak those pads in urine and hold them against their face. It kept the gas off them. Yeah. Temporary measure until they came up with proper gas masks. And there were numerous versions of gas masks. This one was the 2 soldiers with a gas mask, and their mule's got one on as well. The only thing is, poor mule's got nothing over his eyes. The eyepieces are down by his mouth. And I wonder whether this was just a joke or whether, they did in some way try to protect their animals. So, the train, this is the bit that fascinates me. If you were evacuated by train, you either go to the base hospital or to the ship to come home to Blighty. And this is a picture of them loading a train, and it took a long time to load it. So there were 100,000 casualties were evacuated in 1 month alone by these trains. It took 2 hours to load them, and when they got to the other end, it took 2 hours to unload them. The trains, when they were loaded, could go 20 miles an hour. A bit like Buckley, isn't it? I saw something on the internet today, warning to cyclists, please give us 1.5 metre berths when you're overtaking us on your bike. These trains, initially there weren't many of them, but the train companies really pulled a finger out and produced lots of trains very quickly. If there were other trains on the track that had to give way to this train, although when you read the stories of some of the nurses, they would find that they'd be going along fine, and then suddenly they stopped and they'd be put into a siding because something else was coming along, and they might be in the siding for hours or overnight and not know what was going on. So an ambulance train itself was something like this. Now that seems to be an American picture, but it demonstrates it pretty well. It was a very, very long train. Most of the carriages were wards with sick patients in. In the middle of the train there were carriages for the staff, the doctors, the nurses, the orderlies, and they had first-class accommodation right in the centre, and they had pharmacies and all sorts of things on that train. This is a diagram to demonstrate the staff on board, and all the red people are patients. The next line down are the orderlies. There are quite a few orderlies to deal with all those patients, and only 3 doctors, 3 nurses and 3 chefs. So it's quite a challenge to look after all those men for a number of hours that it took to travel very slowly up to the coast. This is a picture inside a ward carriage, and I think this comes from the train that was kept at the Railway Museum at York for a number of years. It's not there anymore, unfortunately. But that's what the inside of a ward carriage looked like. And what we have there are triple bunks, 3 bunks there, and I think there's another load behind. There's something like 12 beds there. It looks quite clean and orderly, quite tidy, but when you fill it up with injured men, it looks like that. And I don't think the patients were put in any particular order, so there was something of everything in there. So you would have men screaming and shouting in pain. You would have injured men on the top bunk who were dripping blood onto the ones below. Quite often men would die on there. Quite often somebody would be very ill and the doctor would say, at the next station we're stopping, we're putting this man off, he needs some other treatment. So it was a mobile hospital. That was the nurses' treatment room. Doesn't look as ever used. This is their sluice, and that is a couple of padded cells because they did have men who were just freaking out and kicking off. So transferring them from the train to the base hospital, so at the other end they'd be taken off, put in the motor ambulance and taken to the base hospital where they're unloaded and taken in. Plenty of IMC personnel there, and what looks like a hospital porter, I think, with the apron. Base hospital, very, very large. The big, posh hotels on the northern France coast have been taken over as hospitals. So they were very appropriate for hospitals, but they were rather grand. They all look like that. Number 5. And during the course of the war, more and more of these hospitals came aboard. They didn't move, they were static. And if you got that far, you had a pretty good chance of getting back to Britain, back to Blighty. You had something that could be treated, probably. Mostly the staff there were the British Red Cross, doing voluntary work there. And if they were going to go on from there to the UK, they will be taken on stretchers and they will be loaded on the, I suppose you call it the dockyard, lined up in stretchers, waiting to be loaded onto a ship. How long they stayed there, I don't know. I hope it was neither too hot nor too cold for them there, lying there. They obviously didn't get much medical help while they were there. This was one of many hospital ships. They all carried a large red cross on them so they could be identified, because obviously in war you did not bomb a hospital ship. Although lots of hospital ships were sunk and lots of doctors and nurses were killed in the process. Strictly speaking, you let them go. The ship itself, when you took the men from the dockyard, from the ground where they were, you loaded them onto this pallet on their stretchers, and then they were hoisted by crane onto the ship. And so we've got about a dozen there, haven't we, being hoisted onto the ship. And from there they were taken and put in beds, and the beds actually were cots, because obviously if you're an injured man and you're on a ship that might be rolling a lot, you don't want to roll out of the bed, so you were nursing cots as you travelled across the channel. And when you got to the other side, Now, if you, some went to Dover and some went to Southampton, depending where you were travelling from. But if you went from Boulogne, you went to Southampton and you arrived at Netley Hospital. These were the nurses who are lined up waiting for their soldiers to arrive. You can see they've got these wheeled contraptions again. And they're waiting for the train to come in. So when they came off the ship, they went on to another train, and that went to its own station. Netley had its own station. That's Netley Hospital in the back. And that's what Netley Hospital looked like from the air. Now that doesn't do it justice. It's actually much longer than that. At the back were enormous cemeteries. Now this hospital had been in use since the previous century. I actually have a distant relative who died there of some sort of manic condition. This was definitely a military hospital for many years. If you were taken there, you probably had a good chance of recovery. There's nothing left of it now. I've been there. The only thing that is left is that tower in the centre. You can go up the tower and look at the solent in front of you. But the rest of it has been demolished. The graveyard is still there. There were lots of military hospitals. Lots of buildings were commandeered to be used as military hospitals. This one is Brighton Pavilion, the dome in Brighton Pavilion. Those beds all have Indian soldiers in them. The whole of the pavilion is full of Indian soldiers. And there's not a lot of privacy there, is there? You're just on the bed with everybody else, no privacy. So the local hospitals, we've got something wrong here with the formatting. There were 3,000 auxiliary hospitals. They were a cross between a military hospital and a convalescent hospital. 3,000 around the country, only some can be identified. So that's Leeswood Hospital, up by Mould. That looks to me like it was a building put up specially to house them. This is Hoole Bank in Chester. Does anybody know that building now? That's the school. I can't think what the school's called. School for girls. The potential ballet dancers go. And this one is the City Hospital as it has been demolished. It's been the workhouse before that. And that's Holywell Hospital. It's the workhouse infirmary which was built in 1913, and in 1917 it was commandeered by the military and used as a military hospital. I have looked for other local hospitals in this area and I can't find many. I don't know why. The only ones I've come up with are, first of all, we do know that Kinhall Park Camp in Rhyl, after we sent the Canadians home, the hospital was turned into a hospital for venereal diseases, so we do know that much. There was a hospital called Talardy, and I take it that is probably the hotel on the roundabout, but I can't see any proof of that. I think somebody quite important had lived there in the past, so I assumed that was a hospital. There was a Rhuddlan District Auxiliary Hospital. Does anyone know that one? What's that now? Is it still there?
Still there, yes.
Still there, it's got another
This one, Pendrafine, I can't work out where that is in Holywell. Can't remember the trace of it. And Eaton Hall, the Grosvenor residence, that was the hospital for officers. This was the uniform that the patients wore, so obviously if they were nursed in bed they were in their pyjamas, but once they were up and about they wore this hospital blues uniform, sometimes called hospital undress, and it was this blue flannel suit and it had a white facing on the collars. The men wore it with a white shirt and a red tie, and they all wore their own regimental cap, so you could tell where they were from. And any picture you see of men in a hospital will be dressed like that. You'll know they are the patients everywhere. became medals, they were allowed to wear their medals. So some nurses died in the war, quite a few I would imagine. Those that we know about really, most died from influenza, including a Canadian nurse out of Rhuddlan. She never actually nursed abroad. She came from Canada, did some nursing here, and then died from influenza. Some died from shell fire, and particularly this one, Nellie Spindler. Now, I came across her grave when I was out there. She's the only nurse, the only female in the cemetery ever. Listen, look. She was a nurse from Leeds. She'd been nursing quite a long time. She was out there. She shared a tent with another nurse. The other nurse had gone off to get something. Meanwhile, a shell hit the tent, and the piece of the shell went through Nellie's back and came out the front. And she lasted 20 minutes and died in her friend's arm. So she is buried there now. That's her grave. So I'm sure there were plenty of others like that. It's just that that's the one I came across. And after the war, well, what did people do next? This one's lucky, she's found a man. Man who presumably has got 2 legs. I have my doubts about marrying a soldier from the First World War. I wonder what sort of baggage he brings with him, how that marriage went. And also, I'm quite shocked that she got married in that uniform. Maybe that's all she had. And for those nurses in the room, I was saying earlier, many of the pictures I've seen of nurses who are sitting down eating their dinner, they're wearing their aprons. We were never allowed to eat in our aprons, were we? No. They're dirty. She got married in her apron. Yeah. A lot of those carried on nursing. Some of them felt that the experience had been exciting and they wanted more, and they went off around the world and did other things. Some returned to civilian life and found it very, very difficult. Couldn't get work. There were not enough men. Couldn't get a husband. So it really was, although everybody was thrilled that the war was over, it really wasn't that good. After the war, there was a lot of problems. It's another story, really. So that's all for now. So there we are. That's a brief journey through what happened in the First World War if you were injured. Questions? No questions?
I know there are a lot of ex-nurses in the room, so I'm sure there must be questions.
When you said about money, you said it's about 1966, I started on £19 a month.
Yeah, I started in 67. I thought it was about that much, yes.
£19 a month.
I managed
to live on it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Just about, with help from the dad.
So we didn't have much to spend it on, did we?
No, not really. The only thing you had to watch out for was your stockings.
Stockings.
Or the my case was there.
I think today's nurses don't know how lucky they are wearing those untidy scrubs. They don't have to buy stockings. And of course, because they were black, if they laddered, you just had to get another pair, didn't you?
There's nothing you could do, there's nothing you could throw them away.
Any more questions for Celia? If not, sincere thanks, Celia. That was very informative, very interesting, and I'm sure for a lot of people in the room, it brought back memories of people from our own families.
There is a lot of information out there. There are a lot of books, there are a lot of nurses' diaries, there's a lot of stuff on the internet, and you can find out a lot more. And increasingly, there are lots of pictures on the internet. 10 years ago, there weren't many. So.
I'm actually reading a book at the moment about the 80s.
Are you?
Called Poppy Sisters. It's about 2 sisters. It's very, very interesting.
Yes, yes. A lot of the nurses kept diaries.
Yeah, it's really, really good. Yeah.
I read one about a girl who worked, she was put onto the trains back from the intermediate station to the coast, and that's what she did back on the
What I want to know at the moment about the trains, if the doctors and nurses took 500 injured men to Galois to go on the ships, they went back to get more men. So did they take an empty train back?
I don't think they stuck them up. I think they must have taken provisions.
I think they must have done. I haven't seen any record of that.
Yeah, and also I think they took men who were fit.
Yes.
I think in some cases they went back a weekend.
Because those bunk beds would fold up.
Yes.
And you could see something.
I can just about remember this book I read. But as you said, there's all the down trains.
One of the problems with the trains was that they used the railway that the supply system used. The supply system that brought in food and weapons. And so the Germans knew where the railways were and they were holding the trains, many trains. But not talking.
Well, if there are no more questions, again, I would just like to thank Celia for coming this evening and giving us a most interesting and informative talk. And as I said, I'm sure for a lot of people in the room, it brought back memories of relatives of our own. So thank you very much, Celia. You know, we may meet again at some point. We might have something else up your sleeve that would be interesting.
Oh, there were two things I wanted to say to them. One was that somebody has contacted me and said that she thinks her grandfather was an American GI who got shipped back to America before his girlfriend got to the camp to tell him she was pregnant. And the question is, does anyone know if there were American GIs in Kinmel camp in the Second World War? I think there must have been. She wants to know. But the camp was The other thing is that tonight I forgot to bring something with me. My daughter distracted me. We have about 200 copies of a book about Kinmel Camp, the Canadian riots. And it's the story written by Julian Prudowski in 1989. It was written for the Finnish Historical Society Journal. It's Journal 32. We no longer have paper copies of that. You can read it online. But only a month or two ago did we discover 200 copies sitting in the basement of the record office. And the record office wanted them gone to my garage. So we're trying to sell those, and I meant to bring some. There's a few books. Somebody told me the other day to take some of that with a pinch of salt. That one.
Yeah.
It's still interesting.
They've got.
They ran it because they had influenza, didn't they? They were frightened. They rioted because they couldn't get home. Well, there was an influenza outbreak.
The ships to take them home, some were turned back, they were not fit for habitation, and some were commandeered by the American forces who hadn't been in the war very long, and so that was But the Canadians have been rioting everywhere they were. They've been rioting in France, they were into rioting.
Well, I'm sure Celia is not going to run away. If anybody's got any questions that they would like to talk to her or ask questions, she will be here. It just leaves me again to thank Celia for coming this evening. So if we can thank her in the usual way. The next meeting, as I said, is the 6th of October, when we have Adrian Hughes talking about Commonwealth War Parades. Before that, on the 29th of September, we're having an action replay of the History Day that we did in May in the library. So it'll be a similar format. If anybody's able to help, yes please. But it will start at 10 o'clock and it'll run till 12:30, restart at 1:30 and finish at 4. And if you're lucky, you'll get a cup of tea or coffee as well. That's not a bribe.